And welcome back, everyone. We are having another theoretical look at what happened in the FIDE Grand Swiss. Today was round number 5, and some of the games are still in progress, but I can already draw some conclusions. For example, the world champion Gukesh actually lost his game with the black pieces against Abhimanyu Mishra, so there have been quite a few unexpected results, but at the same time also quite a few very interesting ideas in the opening, and generally the games, I believe, are just of a very high quality. Maybe I'm sort of not mentioning this enough since we are mostly going into some of the theoretical discussions, but the quality of the games is basically unmatched. Some people, of course, or some players are sort of complaining about the time control, that it is extremely exhausting. Some games take up to 8 hours. And it becomes increasingly difficult to win games because the players simply have so much time to defend sometimes even the worst of all positions. But now let's have a look at what happened today. First of all, the biggest or most surprising idea to me was actually played by Alexander Grischuk. And here in the position you're seeing, b5 was played by Sasha in that game. What is this position? For those of you who are maybe not so familiar with the Sicilian, this arises from one of the big lines in the Najdorf after a6. Now, his opponent, Grischuk's opponent, Aryan Chopra, played the move bishop e3 at first, and then Grischuk went knight g4, and after bishop c1, knight f6 back, typical repetition, and only now after f3, now we came to this position, and Grischuk played the move b5, which I always thought is pretty dubious. Typically, black should not play b5 so early in the Najdorf because it often can run into some direct counter-attack on the queen side, for example, with a4. And I've spent some time analyzing this, and it turns out that it is actually playable. I think it's still sort of a one-game idea, but it is quite interesting, and black is just sort of staying flexible with the pawn on e7. Sometimes he can still go for e5, sometimes he can go for e6, but sometimes even he could go for some g6 setups later on. I've also checked a little bit before that, so just to give sort of some explanations about the general theory, like bishop g5 is of course the main move here, and after h6, bishop h4, and now this is the type of position which you can get out of there. There's a lot of theory here as well, and but generally black is doing pretty well, and the positions tend to be quite unbalanced, as Najdorf players are probably looking forward to it. After bishop c1, by the way, knight f6 is the best, but I think it's also possible to play on with knight c6 in case you're interested in playing this line with black as well and they're not satisfied with the draw so early on. h3, knight f6, and bishop e3 is always sort of seen as the most dangerous move here. g4 is also possible, but it's only transposing to the h3 line. I think that here this could also arise, and it would be a transposition after the move g6 here, and I believe that black is generally doing quite okay here. There was this idea always with bishop h6, which always looked quite funny, and the idea is just to go e5 later on. And yeah, white can take on f6, but that's a completely different story. But generally, black is doing pretty okay here. Bishop e3 is definitely the critical move. And I've checked some possibilities here overall. It was certainly the critical line, and the best for black is to go for this with e5 and bishop e6, where you now have a Najdorf with the knight on c6, but on the other hand, white has already committed himself to going h3, queen f3, rook c8, and there's a lot of theory here in those lines with knight a5, but generally black also gets a lot of play on the queen side. I also thought that knight takes d4 is interesting. I was checking this a little bit with the computer as well, and computers don't really like this so much, this approach, since you are kind of giving up the tension in the center quite early and exchanging one pair of pieces, but I don't think that white's play is so easy here. I guess the most normal move, at least to me, looked like queen d2. And after bishop e6, long castle, black has many ideas with queen a5 and rook c8, maybe b5, b4 later on, or just bishop e7, short castle. And white definitely has the d5 square and can play for g4 and g5. But it's also not so clear where his attack is actually going on the king side. The computer says that queen d3 is more precise, and then a position like this can also arise. And he says that white is better in those positions, which, well, if he says so, then it must be true, but still I see the practical value here for black overall. You could think of doubling on the c-file, for example, and then have some ideas to sacrifice the exchange on c3 later on. So this is certainly playable. But now let's go on to Grischuk's idea, since this is kind of the main point of the video, that he played b5 here so early. To understand all of that, I mean, you should also be familiar with some of the nuances in e5 and e6. e6 is not really played nowadays so much anymore, but it used to be the main line. Black typically followed it up with b5 and then knight d7, and there's a lot of theory in those lines. If the knight goes back, then black typically plays for d5 immediately, which is still playable, but it can become quite dangerous for black overall. e5 nowadays is by far the main line, and here theory mostly continues something like this. There was actually another game today by Velimir Ivic with the black pieces. I think it was here knight b6 and queen d2, d5. I think Velimir managed to equalize, but later on, I believe, lost the game with the black pieces against Ivan Zemlyansky. And the idea of b5, as I've said numerous times now, is sort of to stay flexible and ask white how he wants to develop. And if white develops in the normal fashion with bishop e3, then black can start with bishop e7, then knight d7, and then keep the options of going g6 or e6 or e5. Bishop e3 was played by Aryan Chopra, Grischuk's opponent, which I also guess that it's going to rise in many of your games as well, because white is just typically developing like this. But it's probably not the most critical move. Something along the lines of knight d5 should be played. Computer says that knight d5 immediately is probably the best objective try. And then some pretty strange positions arise like this, where black has to go for the kingside fianchetto, but white also generally has to be quite precise. Like, you should go for some early c4, otherwise black isn't in time to develop with short castle and knight d7 and so on. And now after short castle, I had some fun analyzing different lines here. Bishop e7, rook c1. There were a couple of correspondence games, and the positions that came out were generally just absolutely crazy. White was typically the one pressing, of course, in all of those lines. Let me think, what was the funniest one? I think it was somewhere along the lines of this. That was pretty cool, when white had two rooks and a piece against the queen, but in some correspondence game from 2022, black was able to hold. Again, here h4 was, I think, the only move which gave some of an edge to white to develop the rook to h3, but still black is collecting a lot of pawns. Now also bishop takes h4, because this is not effective because of queen takes e3. But I think there was an even funnier line. Let me try to look for it. Well, that was possible as well, to go for some strange endgames like this, where black was barely holding in most of those lines. There was another incredibly entertaining line. Well, that one as well. Yeah, I think it was this one actually. Let me see how that got there. So we were at that position, and we were looking at c7, but a3 here. And in some correspondence game, black played queen b8. I just wanted to show you the position that that came out in the end. So of course, if white gets a couple more moves, then black can just resign. But black is collecting the rook on h1. b5, and of course white now, if he gets again a couple more moves, he just is going to have at least one more queen on the 8th rank. So black has to play for counterplay with d5, and if the rook moves, then maybe d4 could come as well, or the bishop could drop back to e5. So b6, d takes e4, and b7. This is how the correspondence game continued. Now bishop e5, white has to queen on c8, because if he queens on b8, then black can just take, and in the very end take with the bishop, and black is just a rook up. And it was quite funny that this position is probably like a strategical draw, because both sides don't really have any way to improve the position. I mean, white is still the one which has probably the more promising position, because he has many threats with b8 queen. But at least objectively, it seems like it was holding somehow for black. Anyway, there's probably not much purpose in showing all of those lines. I just thought it was quite entertaining, the positions that can arise out of there. So again, after knight d5, you should take on d5. Otherwise, white could maybe take on f6 himself or push a4. And then go for g6, bishop g7, and so on. And I'm honestly not really sure if many players are even going to go for c4 here. And if they do, then this is the line which you need to follow and be prepared in knight c6. Again, all of this was sort of the only line for white, so I'm sure that Grischuk was extremely well prepared here. I also thought that e4 is quite critical when b4 is kind of forced, because taking on a4 is typically just not great for our pawn structure, and the pawn on a6 can be a long-term target. So b4, knight d5, take, and again, something along the lines of g6 is probably the best way to continue for For black, however, what I didn't really like so much here is that the pawn on b4 is kind of a weakness, and sometimes we have to sacrifice it, but it still seemed like black does get some compensation in most of those lines. a5 was played. Let me just think what actually happens after queen takes b4. Well, knight b6 would run into all sorts of ideas with knight c6. Not sure, actually. Maybe rook b8 is possible, and then we are threatening bishop takes d5, or maybe knight b6 or knight e5. So as far as I remember, a5 was sort of the only critical move, and then some positions like that can arise when, of course, if white is able to consolidate, he's just going to be a pawn up. But yeah, practically speaking, black still has compensation. There was one game in the second Polish league, Kolozowski against Jonas Baum, and it ended in a draw later on. Both pretty decent players. So I believe that those two lines should be critical, a4, knight d5 for sure. But as I said in the beginning, bishop e3 is probably quite likely to appear on the board. Then Grischuk went bishop b7. Aryan went queen d2 here. G4 immediately is also possible. Generally, I believe that this should be black's response here, just going h6 to stop g5. And then something like this could appear when, again, we can sort of save this tempo with e6. That was one line which I was looking at. And white also does have some difficulties. Like if they take here, then just d takes e5, and on the next move, we can take on a2, and maybe even take on a2 immediately. Well, then queen takes b4 would probably not be good news. But yeah, taking on c5, and then I guess taking on a2 in the next move. So Grischuk's opponent played queen d2. Still, I think this is quite likely to appear in practical games. Now knight bd7, and white played a3, and here another point of the line. Now Grischuk went for h5, which is actually going to transpose to some other line. Like in the English attack, it's also a more common line here after f3, e6, bishop e3. It's lined with h5 here, which I've also played with black and actually recommended also in my Najdorf course, which is not the newest anymore. I think it came out like 4 years ago. But the line is still actually not bad at all for black. The idea is just to stop g4 and play on the queen side later on anyway. So this is how Grischuk played. Now bishop e2. Quite understandably, Aryan was scared of castling queenside here because, well, he's not going to get any counterplay with g4 anytime soon, and black can develop with either e6 or g6, and generally black is aiming for this plan to play knight b6, knight d7, knight e5, and then put a knight to c4 when already many sacrifices on the queen side could be possible. So white played bishop e2, e6, short castle, and now rook c8, which was not entirely necessary. Bishop e7 immediately would have been possible as well. But generally here, Grischuk has equalized, and yeah, it was just a game. Later on, he was better. The game is actually still ongoing as we speak, but now it does look like Grischuk is in some trouble, so he might lose in the very end, which is unfortunate because I'm always a big Grischuk fan, and he has many interesting ideas in the opening. He's just a very entertaining person in general. So that was the first idea I wanted to show you. Also, another quick side note about another game, which was played between Dimitri Kolas and Hammer Jon Ludwig. And it was in the fried liver, so in the Italian with knight f6, knight g5. Dimitri was white against Hammer, as I said. Now d5, e takes d5, and Hammer played this move knight d4, which also didn't really ring a bell to me. I mean, I, of course, knew this, well, knight a5 being the main move, and where there's a lot of theory here. And also the move b5, which also has some sort of name, but currently I cannot recall how the line is called with b5. This line with b5 actually saw some sort of revival recently, because black has managed to find some new ideas. The best line for white, the best move, is actually bishop f1. I think that's still among masters, I guess this is kind of common knowledge that bishop f1 here should be the best move. The point is that if white captures immediately on b5, then queen takes d5 is quite uncomfortable, and it's a double attack on b5 and g2. And now if the bishop would go back to f1, then black is getting a lot of play with, I don't know, something like this, bishop b7, long castle, and generally white is very underdeveloped. So that's why bishop f1 is the best move. And now if queen takes d5, then knight c3 is unpleasant and the queen is getting kicked out, and then white can take on b5 in the next move. So that's why the old line continued bishop f1 and only now knight d4. So I was familiar with this one here. And the ideas are sort of similar to what we're seeing in the Hammer game, but this line always had quite a, not a fully correct reputation. However, nowadays people are starting to pick up the line again because of this new invention to just sacrifice the pawn and again play for immediate ideas like queen d7, long castle if white allows it, and also white is still sort of underdeveloped. The main line continues d4, e takes d4, and long castle, I think, and black needs to play for queenside castling. Maybe it was queen d7, long castle, or bishop e7 first. I'm not entirely sure anymore. Maybe it was bishop e7, something along those lines. I've checked, and queen d7, and it goes on. In the end, black is fine here. But let me tell you quickly about what Hammer did. So he started with knight d4, and after c3, now he could go for b5, but it would transpose to what we just talked about earlier. But instead, he goes for h6 here. And this was something I think I've never seen before. So he wants the same position in the b5 line, just without the inclusion of b5 and bishop f1, which does make sense because b5 is kind of a move that burns down a lot of bridges behind you. Sometimes the pawn can also be hanging there. So he went for the move h6 here, and white, I believe, has two critical replies. Colors was definitely prepared here because Hammer already had one or two pretty recent games here from the black side. And Colors went arguably for the most critical line, c takes d4. Knight takes f7 is also possible to give the knight and then take on d4. And some pretty strange positions arise overall. Like bishop d3 check, now black's king has to go back. And one game of Hammer against his Norwegian colleague Urkedal actually ended like this with a move repetition. And I don't think that black can actually escape from that, so that's sort of one small issue in the line. And white can also continue playing like this. And he is a pawn up, but still has some issues with development to solve, and black does have some threats on the king side. But Colors went for c takes d4, h g5, d takes e5, knight takes d5. And here I felt like black does have pretty decent compensation overall. Well, he went bishop e3 still, I think, being part of his preparation. Just let me demonstrate if white goes for d3. He is gonna stay a pawn up in the end, but I really like black's chances in the long run. The light squared bishop is very strong. h2 can become a weakness. The rook can become active, for example, on h5. So this looked pretty decent for black. I mean, white should also not be worse, but black certainly has a lot of compensation. So bishop e3 was played in the game, queen d3. That's important to stop white from getting d4. And queen c2, bishop f5. White takes on c7. So, I mean, also mind you, white is probably not going to know all of this if they're not specifically prepared for that, just because the line is incredibly rare. I think there are not many games at all in all of that, maybe 10 or something like that. Just to show you what happened in the game after queen c7, bishop e7 now, and Colors actually went queen c3. Another move is knight c3, and here there's this funny idea that we can take on h2, and after this intermediate move, take on f1, and still black keeps compensation just because white has a hard time developing his the rest of his queen side. So queen c3 was played by Colors, and now I guess that Hammer maybe mixed it up or didn't know any further. He played rook h4, and then he became a little bit worse. He couldn't fully keep the control over the d3 square, I think, in the long run, and white's pieces managed to get out, and later on Colors won the game. But more precise would be the move rook d8 here. And after taking, bishop takes d3, rook e1, now knight d5. That's the whole point of playing rook d8, so that rook e3 is not going to be possible. And if knight c3, now knight f4. Computer was giving this here and b3, with some ideas of knight a3 or bishop a3 if it works. But generally this felt pretty comfortable for black. Like, black's pieces are extremely active. White is still not fully developed. If knight c3 comes, then maybe the rook can go to d4 or to d7. The bishop on d3 is just incredibly strong here. That was kind of hard to believe that black should be in too much trouble here. yeah, anyway, that was it for today. I think those were two pretty cool ideas. I hope they can be useful for you. You might be able to include them in your repertoire. One E45 idea and one Najdorf idea. I think that means that we had a good day at the Grand Swiss. I will still now check out what actually happened in the rest of the games. I believe that Grischuk lost, but yeah, we're gonna find out together. I'm just seeing that today's video was a bit longer. I hope that was also in accordance with what you guys are hoping to see from that event. Again, let me know if you have any more suggestions, what I can cover. Apart from that, that was it for today. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.